Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And an inescapable reality about our journey through this world is that one day, for all of us, this journey will end. We will die. We all face mortality. How then do we make sense of our life in this world given that final destination that awaits us all? And this means that one of our great gifts we can get is a person, individual, who is already living in that last stage of life and has the wherewithal and wisdom to share guidance to the rest of us from that last place. When we encounter someone who is facing death and who is also willing to share notes with the rest of us from that place, well, we would be very smart to drop everything and pay close attention. And that's the opportunity we have now. Our guest is Amy Lowe. Amy is a managing director of Emerson Collective, a philanthropy that invests in the public good in a variety of ways. More relevantly for our conversation, she's the author of a new book, The Brave in Between, Notes from the Last Room. Amy, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Hi. Well, it's a treat to be here. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So thanks for hosting me.
Well, Amy, your book is a wonderful book. I'm so eager to introduce our listeners to it. The subtitle is Notes from the Last Room, and the last room is your metaphor for this last stage of life. So please explain to our audience why you consider yourself to be in the last room.
So I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic colon cancer in July of 2019. I'll just say at the front end here, colon cancer now is the second leading cause of death. Cancer death in the U.S., it's spiking among younger populations, which is true around the world for reasons we don't really know. I often say, Chadwick Boseman in some ways is the face of the reality of colon cancer today. We lost him far too young. I think he was still in his 30s. He's one of those people that looked really healthy, but actually wasn't. And that's true of so many of us with colon cancer. So it's an incredible public health burden. You can now be screened at 45. When I was diagnosed, I was 48, and the screening then was 50. Today it's 45. The best birthday gift you can give yourself when you turn 45, get screened, because it's also the most preventable kind of cancer if you do a screening. So do it for yourself, do it for Chadwick Boseman and the Black Panther. But it's a way to take what is a devastating diagnosis and turn it into an easy thing to catch. So there I was, just minding my own business, and all of a sudden this terrible, terrible diagnosis came along. I went through the classic kind of modes of shock and disbelief and all of that, and then moved toward what is sort of the classic pathway for patients like me. You typically do a lot of intensive chemo. Often there's surgery, and then there's more chemo. And just as another little piece of context, because I may reference it quite a bit, colon cancer often travels colon, liver, lung. That's how it moves in the body. And so that's the case for me. The original tumor was just a little tiny, tiny spot kind of up near my rib cage, when your large intestine, I don't know why we call it the colon now, but anyway, it's like a big garden hose. When it turns, that's where my little source tumor was. I had a very large tumor on my liver and some worrisome spots in my lung. So I thought, okay, well, this is likely the end. I didn't know anyone really that had moved through cancer. I was, as I mentioned, the first in my family. So at the time, my kids were 16 and 14. And those first few weeks, I just thought, I'm going to likely kind of shrivel up and hopefully I'll get a few months and that'll be that. And one of the surprises was, as I kept moving through, strangely, I felt kind of fine. I didn't feel great, but the chemo was tolerable. The tumor on my liver was shrinking dramatically. Most days, people had no idea that I was even sick. I was just living this odd duality of looking okay, feeling kind of okay, and yet holding this just dreadful reality that I likely only had a few months left to live. And so 6 months into this, I had a successful surgery and things were moving along. Um, and yet my story continued to get more complex because the little spots that we saw in my lung um, were um, were not going away. And so for me, the last 5 years, and I have been at this now for 5 years, has really been the story of my lungs. I have little spots that just don't want to give me up. So when I was diagnosed, and I think the statistic is still true today, only 14% of colon cancer people survive past 5 years. So I am just extraordinarily grateful that I'm still here. Um, and yet, the longer I moved through this season of, this is going to sound a little strange, but um, I was very ill, but I didn't feel sick. I know that's kind of a strange paradox, but the longer I lived in that duality, the more I realized, okay, this is clearly my last room. And if you read the book, you'll know I can't get through a paragraph or two without working in a metaphor. It's just sort of how I think and how I process information. And I thought, this is holy ground, this space that I occupy. And if our lives are a series of chapters, and I think they are, I sort of reframed them as rooms. And this is most likely my last. Um, and I'll just conclude by kind of making an observation that will kind of be a through line through our conversation. One of the insights that I had was, well, look, if you are especially fortunate, and if the world is designed in all of the way it ought to perform, as you mentioned, all of us are going to be in the last room. It's the most human experience of all. But if you're especially fortunate, you wake up every day and you know you're there, and you're probably very tired, or maybe your knee has hurt for like 5 years, which is to say, perhaps you're 91 and you're just at the end. But hopefully you're surrounded by great love, great care, and you're aware, but maybe you're not ready, but you're very, very conscious of the fact that you're stepping into the last stages of your life. And that's what we all want. I mean, that's the goal. I have a lovely public health physician friend named Shri, and he looked at me once and he said, the role of the doctor is to make sure that every one of his or her patients dies of old age. That's what we're here for. And I thought, oh my gosh, you've just distilled everything down to this beautiful aspiration. Okay, so that's the hope, is that we all be last room people, knowing that we're there, but we're really tired. There's another group of last room people who have no idea that they're there at all, and yet they feel great. They feel phenomenal, which is to say, they may go out on a long bike ride this afternoon, and they're going to get clipped by a car, and we're going to lose them. Mm-hmm. And they had no idea they're in the last room at all. So I inhabit a rather odd spot, or at least slightly unusual spot, where I know I'm there, and yet most days I feel pretty good. And I thought, okay, I'm not alone. There's a lot of us that occupy that space. But I thought there's got to be something here that's important, or at least there could be some observations or wisdom that I can share with folks that are in other rooms. And so that's what began my kind of thought that there might be something here worth capturing.
Well, and I think there is, because I think your book is full of wisdom precisely for people like us, like myself, who can easily avoid the inevitable reality of mortality. I'm not currently, as far as I know, have some life-threatening diagnosis, but I could, and I certainly, like you said, I could die at any moment. And what then? How then ought that shape how we live, think, pray, relate to our loved ones, relate to God? I think those are profound questions that your book is a helpful accompaniment to that kind of questioning that we all need to do. And you talk about rooms as almost chapters in your life. Well, the room and the chapter you begin this story is a painful room and a painful chapter in your life about your marriage at that point. Can you explain why you chose to begin this whole story there?
Yeah. Um, so one of the things, so I was married for 13 years to the love of my life. I adored him. And sadly, my marriage ended in, just in a crisis. Uh, I had discovered he had been involved in a long-term affair, and I carried extraordinary trauma from that. We tried for many months to repair the marriage, but the wounds were just, too great. Um, I decided that this was an important element to this book because, and I know this might sound a little bit provocative to some of your listeners or your audience, but for me, it's true. I say with great candor that divorce is far harder than cancer. Now, I'm going to be really clear about this. See, divorces come in all different shapes and sizes, and I appreciate for some people it's a healing bridge. It's a place of liberation, and I understand that. And also, cancer comes in a million different flavors and forms, and so it's a tricky statement. But for me, um, the wound and uh, the devastation was far, far more acute with the end of my marriage. And as a small practical plot detail, the way it kind of unfolded, we were living in Seattle, kind of just scrambling to sort of survive and to figure out what was going to happen. Um, I was offered a wonderful opportunity to move to where I live now in the Bay Area. I live in Menlo Park, to work alongside Lorene Powell Jobs at the Emerson Collective. And um, my then husband said, okay, well, whatever happens, whether we can sort of repair what's been broken or we divorce and we co-parent, I'll be in the area. I'll join you. Let me sell the house and I'll be there. So at the time, my kids were fifth grade and third grade. And I said, okay. And without belaboring too much, what happened is that didn't happen. He chose not to live here. And within a matter of weeks, I became a single parent and had two little kids and a brand new job and needed to find a new church and develop a new set of friends. And it was a chaotic time, as you can imagine. So several years later, when I was diagnosed, one of the great twists of my story is that over that expanse of time, as it turns out, my then ex-husband was a deeply, deeply devoted and wonderful father. My kids did see him all the time. I traveled a fair amount for work, so he always came um, uh, to stay with the kids when I traveled. They went and saw him quite a bit in Orange County. Um, they would say that their relationship with their dad was really strong and intact. But as a practical matter, I actually rarely saw him. A lot of divorced couples sit together at little league games or they figure out birthdays. That wasn't the story with us. I would like fly in from Chicago and land, and he would be flying out 30 minutes earlier, and he sort of became a ghost to me. So there wasn't animosity or bitterness. It's just that he wasn't physically a part of my life. So I got sick. And if you get sick with the kind of severity that I had, the two most important characters on the stage, of course, were my two kids, Connor and Lucy. That was just urgently clear to me. And if you really hold that truth, then the reality is, well, then the next most important character is their dad, because they're going to probably lose their mom. And so Don re-entered my life, and he reached out immediately and said, "Can I do this with you?" And it was a startling, disorienting kind of notion. Um, and the reason that I felt so strongly about including this in the book is that one of the core pieces that I learned through the last room is a deeper space of forgiveness and really what that entails. And so you're right, the first scene is a tender one, it's a tricky one, but it sets up a deeper reckoning that I have around forgiveness and what this would mean for my own story, my children, and their future.
Well, I think that characterizes one of wonderful qualities of your book, which is it is full of so many surprises and turns that actually have deep meaning embedded. They're not just plot twists, although they are plot twists that make the book, I think, very readable, but they are plot twists that actually convey a deeper turn. And one of these turns is from this turn from betrayal, which was you describe as such a painful betrayal, to forgiveness. And you have a section here that I'm going to read. On page 72, you said, forgiveness is far more mysterious and magical. Forgiveness is seeing the person who has wronged you and then choosing to embrace the person as they are, if they are entirely separate from they have wrought. There is no, and now my gift to you, to the person you're forgiving, is to enable you to begin your own reckoning for what led to these decisions, an open gateway for a season of coming to terms. There is no penance or judgment here. You will not have me correcting, admonishing, or litigating your reckoning. Instead, I simply see and hold your true self. That's such a beautiful description of forgiveness. It feels like it must have been so hard won to arrive at that place. And I think one of the great ironies is, as you describe, in this really unexpected way, the experience of cancer actually helped you heal from that
Yeah.
betrayal and helped you arrive at that place of healing and deep forgiveness. It's remarkable, and I think for those of us, and I count myself, who have people and institutions that I need to forgive right now, and I'm really struggling to do so, there's some hard-won wisdom for us in there. Can you expand on that, and just how is it that being in that last place enabled you to get to this place of deep wisdom? Because people like me need to learn from that. We need to benefit from that. Tell us more why confronting your mortality enabled you to get to this deeper place of forgiveness.
Yeah, it's such an important cornerstone of the beginning of the book. So, I'll say it this way. So I grew up in a Christian home. I was really um, blessed and fortunate to grow up in a community and with a family that embraced what I think are the most virtuous tenets of Christianity. I was just one of the lucky ones where we talked a lot about social justice and about caring for the least of these. And um, it wasn't until later that I began to realize, there's a big wing of our Christian world that seems to have embraced fear more than faith. What I would say is I was very, very comfortable with the language of forgiveness. And as I was recovering from my marriage falling apart, friends would ask me, "Well, have you've really forgiven him?" And I said, "Oh, yes. I mean, I, you know, we're doing pretty well. I think Don carries a lot of wounds. The kids seem to be thriving. There's no animosity. I think we're all on the way." I mean, that would be sort of my standard language. Well, I didn't know what I was talking about. I mean, I was basically putting a pause button on let's just get rid of the conflict and we're all going to sort of be okay, I guess. But one of the reasons that I say divorce, at least for me, was harder than cancer is that, see, with respect to my divorce, see, when you go through betrayal, see, your story is taken away from you. The memories that you hold, the day that you remember, the
Mm.
moment that you're at dinner and for some reason, your spouse goes outside to take a phone call. All of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, it wasn't a phone call at all. I mean, it
Oh,
was a call, but
ouch.
it wasn't what we
Yeah.
thought. And so you have to reorient the entire moment and you go through months and months and months of recasting your story. Well, see, our stories are the most intimate thing that we hold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cancer takes away your future, and, and,
Mm.
and that's terrible. But the future really isn't ours. We haven't written it yet. And so it's
Mm.
this sort of abstract notion. So what happened for me was that I thought, well, look, I, again, if the two most important characters in my story at that point were my two kids, I wanted them to see their mom fully and completely embracing their dad
Mm. Wow.
as a child of God, as a beautiful person who was not one thing. Like any of us, he's 10 million things.
Mm.
And he made a terrible, terrible set of mistakes. And he also was one of the most miraculous, magical people I'll ever meet.
Mm.
And we have to find a way in our culture, I think, to hold those paradoxes with a lot more grace, frankly, humor and imagination.
Yeah.
And I wanted my kids to see, I thought of myself kind of like the four of us were going over a bridge. And if we were all holding hands and I had to let go of them, I wanted them to know that they were going to be in a relationship with their dad that was full, that was beautiful, and that I was affirming all of it. They weren't getting some kind of side eye from me, or they weren't saying, well, remember what he did though. I mean, like, none of that. And more, what I wanted, and this is the great gift of forgiveness, if you really embrace this truth that you just read, that no, this thing that you did no longer is a part of our story. You are a child of God, and it's your job to go and grapple with the harm. Um, what that does, like this is the thing that the last room taught me, is that is the doorway to creating new sets of stories.
Mm.
So you don't carry the wound as part of your narrative arc that moves through
Mm.
all of the rest of your years.
Mm.
And now that's hard because I thought, well, if I really do this and I'm gone, well, I mean, like, who's going to tell my story? What
Yeah.
if I disappear? And I think that's the fear a lot of us have with forgiveness is if I really do this, well, A, you might get off the hook, which doesn't feel
Right.
right,
Yeah.
which seems kind of strange. And two, I might disappear. The thing
Mm.
that you caused will no longer be central. And that doesn't seem very fair. Now, that's hard enough, but if you're about ready to die, that's terrible because
Mm.
what you want is everybody to know. And I thought, no, because what that does is then my two kids may not get to write their own news stories.
Mm.
And I think we can extrapolate that out to larger cultural divides. We've seen, you know, great examples of this around the world and through history, where true forgiveness has enabled a new story to take hold.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we are less good at it today, as frankly
Yeah.
other times, but the last room gave me that urgency and clarity, and I'm really grateful for that.
That's beautiful, Amy. I mean, I think what I'm hearing is the fear of extending forgiveness, like you said, is that the story is going to end with me disappearing or and the wrong that's done for me being just forgotten. But forgiveness transmutes that rather than ending the story. You're actually opening up the story to new possibilities, new hopeful possibilities, like the fact that your children can have a future with their dad in a way that is expanded, is redeemed, precisely because you've released him from
Yeah.
this. I think that's beautiful. That this idea of forgiveness actually not closing down a story, but actually opening up new plot lines that are redemptive and hopeful, and ultimately lead us all to God's forgiveness. You talked earlier about how we need to have more humor and how we hold all of our conflicts, divisions, hard things in lives. And I think one of the beautiful things about your book is the humor. I mean, you're writing a book that begins with a terrible betrayal that leads to a divorce, that then leads to a cancer diagnosis. You would think this is a macabre, heavy slog of a book. It's anything but that. I found it. I read it in one night. It was a page turner, and I think one of the things that makes this book so readable is your humor that are laced throughout it. And I want to actually unpack that this idea of the humor that we experience even amidst something as hard and as dark as this last room. I want to start with just the humor of your observations about your doctors, because
Hmm.
as you rightly point out, anybody who's in a prolonged experience in the last room, that room is populated with a lot of doctors. I mean, a lot of doctors, right? Especially if you have a complex condition the way you are. So you introduce in this book a number of characters, and you give them funny names like Princess Leia, Doctor Phenomenal, the doctor with the Hobbit chair. I want to
Hmm.
ask you to pick one doctor from the range of that and other characters, and introduce to us, the listeners, to that doctor and why that doctor was so meaningful.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that. Well, two things quickly about one about humor. Um, who can stand it? The last room is so absurd.
Yeah.
It's so terrible. If you can't find places to just point out the utter kind of craziness of it all, I think you've missed the point. Now, I can hold some lightness in this because I'm somebody who believes deeply that this last room is is a mere gateway to the grandest set of rooms of all. So my faith enables me to sometimes be able to look at just utter complete horror and find a way to laugh. That doesn't in any way minimize the severity of it, but I do think there is um, something very deeply redemptive about observing just some of the craziness of all of this. So there's a lot of that. I know it is. People sometimes talk about the book. They're like, "Ah, run for the hills. This sounds so terrible." And I'm
Yeah.
like, "No, it's a beach read. It's great. Like you'll find out." And maybe it's somewhere in between. But that said, in addition, I did read a lot of cancer memoir as I was kind of getting going. And one of the things that really troubled me is that I felt like there was kind of a consistent theme in a lot of books that I read about just constant frustration with our medical system and care and certain doctors. And I get that. I mean, I've had some really tough days in the medical world as well. So I'm not diminishing that at all. But I thought it was time to write a bit of a love letter to the healers in our world and anyone who decides to commit themselves to healing. They are angels among us. I don't care if you're a receptionist at an oncology clinic or a nurse or a physician or a surgeon, you are a healer. And healers hold very, very special spot. I did not know any doctors before I got sick. I had a lovely doctor who I went to a physical, and I thought she was great. But zero doctors lived in my life. And now I have more than I can count. So I became enchanted with them, with what brought their calling to the space, the the deep rigor that they each bring, the work that goes into this. I just fell in love with my medical world. So the one that I'll just paint a little picture of is a surgeon at Stanford named Dr. Visser. He was the
the
one who
the
did my.
the well dressed doctor. I loved him. I loved. Say
I
more.
know,
Yeah.
Visser suits, I know. So I met him early on, and he said, "Look, there's a playbook for this. This is terrible. But you're going to do chemo. I'm going to see you in about 6 months." I had a very large tumor on my liver. He said, "That's going to get smaller. I'm going to take it out. Livers are amazing. They regrow. You'll probably end up with a better liver after I'm done with you than when you started. You're going to get an upgrade." And that's how this is going to work. And I'm sitting there in my hospital room thinking, well, I mean, this is great. I mean, this guy's amazing. And the next time I started to meet with him in his clinic, in an exam office, he was wearing this just stunningly beautiful tailored suit and this gorgeous tie. And initially I thought, well, look, I mean, he must have like a really important dinner tonight. Or one time I thought, no, he's probably presenting at a conference this afternoon. I always had this sort of reason for why he was just impeccably dressed. And you have to know, so where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, you know, even some of our most important meetings, we just live in a very kind of casual clothing culture. Maybe that's not as true on the East Coast, but where I live on the West Coast, you'd be hard pressed to find a tie, anywhere in Silicon Valley. Okay. So I at first was like um surprised, and I thought, this really interesting person who has beautiful suits. And then the more I met with them, and the more the suit became standard, the more I realized, oh no 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 no, he is wearing the suit for me. He is bringing excellence to every conversation, and for him, he has chosen to exhibit visual excellence through his dress. Now, I learned a little bit more about Dr. Visser. He's from the Midwest, and maybe he came from a slightly more traditional kind of frame. But I talked at one point to a surgeon who worked with him on my surgery. And I saw her later and said, I have to ask you something. I have this theory about Dr. Visser's suits. And I think he does this for the patients, but am I wrong about this? And she looked at me and she said, oh, you don't even get it. His residents who work with him, the young doctors who are coming up, he insists that all of them come wearing their very best. And if you don't own a suit, you need to find a way to buy a suit. And she said, oh, yeah, one day he actually sent somebody home because they were wearing like white tube socks underneath their suit. And he said, that's not going to work. And I thought, this is love. I mean,
Totally.
there are some who might find that a little off-putting. I said, no, this is love, what he is bringing. And not everybody needs to bring their best clothing finery, but whatever it is that you're going to bring it.
Yeah.
And I found this just symbol in Dr. Visser's commitment through his beautiful suits, and it's just one of many stories of these doctors. Their humanity has harmony with their excellence, and I just adored everything about him. Yeah.
It's a beautiful story. I have my own personal example of that. In my 40s, I went through a very serious liver cancer scare. It turned out not to be cancer, but
Mm,
for months, doctors thought it was. And my liver doctor, hepatologist, was a doctor at UCSF who she's a woman who really dressed like she was stepping out like, out of Elle or, whatever fashion magazine. And
yeah.
I remember always feeling like taking comfort from that in a strange way. And I never
Hmm.
understood why until I read your book. I was like, oh, that's why. It's because
Yeah.
she woke up that morning and said, I am going to put on my best self for the
Yeah.
people that I come across. And I even unknowingly picked up that intention, and that was deeply comforting for me. And I think you're exactly right. It was an act of love. Um,
Yeah.
I want to go back to your observation about humor and why humor is so important. And it's making me realize why I found your book so lovely. Because the humor that you sprinkle into it, at one level, it just relieves tension because you're writing about some very tense things. And I think comedy at a visceral level is about the relief of tension, almost at a bodily level. Like a joke relieves a tension, and that's kind of the bodily explanation of how comedy works. But I think that comedy also works at a deeper moral or spiritual level, and that is the juxtaposition of different stories, if you will. Like comedy is all about contrast, unexpected contrast, right? And so, what happens, I think, in the humor that you're doing is the most immediately I say, wow, that joke that she can say. And I'll give you an example of for listeners, if I can do a spoiler alert to one comedic
Hmm.
moment. There's a moment when you are getting some really bad news that is going to require surgery, and the doctor happens to say, oh, but the good news is you're slim. And then you hear that, and the way you tell the story, you end it with a saying like, but wait, the important takeaway here is you think I'm slim, right? Like, and I just thought that was I laughed out loud because it shows, oh, in the middle of this very tense, serious moment, Amy has this ability to not take herself seriously. And I was thinking about that. I was like, but she's in a serious situation. And so what that tells me is she does live in a different narrative. Like she has parallel narratives going on. She is at one point in that moment in a very dire, serious, dark medical narrative. And yet she's still able to live in another narrative that able to poke a little fun at herself, at her own vanity, and have just be live in a different story that is able to look upon her other self in this other story. And that's beautiful. And I think that's why, um, look, I just think Christians ought to, above all people, ought to be the most self-deprecating, humorous people, because we do have access to this other story that allows us to stand and look at ourselves in the dire story and laugh at it, poke a little fun at it. Tell us more. Was that always true about you, Amy, or
Yeah.
was this something that emerged from this experience?
Well, I'd like to think I'm really funny my whole life. Now, some friends might disagree, but I've, I surround myself, I think, with really, funny people, and I love, 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 the art of humor. That said, I have a theory about this. I don't know if it's completely right, but this is how I've worked it out in my head. The last room is so scary. Who can say there's fear everywhere? Um, you can't mm, avoid it. I mean, it's just awful. However, here's something that I have learned that is so true of this room, and it should be true for all of the rooms of our life. When you're truly in a place of laughter, when the most unexpected moment of humor comes, when, as you point out, you're able to exhale and take a moment because you can observe either the humor of it or the absurdity of it, I promise you, fear and laughter cannot commingle.
Mm,
They
mm,
just live in different. Um, they fly at different altitudes,
mm,
and I, for reasons I don't fully understand, I think that we are living in an era that's over-indexed on fear.
Hmm.
I find that we are afraid of things that are debilitating, but have always been present in our lives. But for reasons that, are sort of true about our politics or our culture, um, fear has become monetized, it's become weaponized. It is a place where you can kind of have a gravitational pull, whether it's through social media or through our politics. And it's causing extraordinary harm. Um, Somehow, humor can be one of the greatest antidotes to that. Now this is tricky because what you don't want to do is minimize things that are truly awful and are truly scary. I mean, there's a place for fear. There truly is. Um, but as you work through the reality of whatever it is that you're grappling with your life, my invitation is find places to be generous and to be open, because when you can bring some humor to the moment, what you're actually doing is you're giving a gift to others in the room with you. I
Mm.
mean, you can laugh by yourself a little bit. I mean, like, I can find things that are funny and I laugh to myself, but that's not quite the same thing. When you bring humor, what you're doing is you're inviting someone who's proximate to you to say, look here, this is actually hilarious. And when you do that, you have all of a sudden brought new sense of human connection.
Mm.
You've created a place of not necessarily confidence, but a place of peace. And what you're able to do, I think, is also say, well, look, uh, this is awful, but there's a bigger story that's going on
Yeah.
here. And when you live in a bigger story, you're able to find those moments to say, and by the way, this little part's really funny.
Yeah.
And it is a gift that you can give anyone that's in your life, whether you're standing in line buying groceries or you're in a really tense medical appointment. It's a tricky needle to thread. I'll say that you don't want to
Yeah.
be too cute with it, but I think we need more humor in our lives and a little less fear. And I have found a way to try to fold that into the book as much as possible.
Yeah, it reminds me of a beautiful little book that Frederick Buechner wrote, which actually I believe you begin with, or there's a quote from Buechner somewhere in your book that I
Yeah.
remember. But it's a book when he talks about the gospel as comedy, tragedy, and fairy tale, and
Yeah.
he talks about why the gospel is comedy is because of the resurrection, because we know we
Yeah.
live in this bigger story, that whatever darkness we're going into, I think that your quote is the whatever the hardest thing you're going to is not the final chapter or something akin to that,
Yeah.
right?
He
Like
says
that,
something like, the worst thing is not the last thing.
the worst thing is not the last thing, and the resurrection
Yeah.
tells us that the worst thing
Right.
is not the last thing. There's a final twist to all of our stories that Jesus
Right.
already demonstrates, and he describes the resurrection as like this big humorous joke, precisely because
Yeah.
it is this turn that is unexpected that
Yes.
tells us that there's this bigger story. And it strikes me again, this is why I think Christians ought to be kind of the most wry, ironic people, because we live in this bigger story of the resurrection that recasts, all of the dark stories that are real in its darkness, but yet can be bathed in almost this comedic light, because we know it's not the final story. And when we can, and,
Yeah.
and I experience your little asides and witty observations or self-deprecatory sort of revelations as like little shafts of light from the resurrection breaking into a very
Hmm.
dark moment and bring a moment of lightness and even laughter. And that's a real gift. So thank you, Amy, for giving that gift. Amy, you talk in your book about the darkest corner of this last room for you, which is for you as a parent to contemplate the loss of your life together with your children. Can you say more about that, and
Yeah.
what wisdom might be contained in there? Because it certainly just feels like something horrible that as a parent we think, oh my gosh, I don't even want to think about that. I don't want to go there, is my
Hmm.
natural reaction as a parent. And yet your book invites us to go there. What's the
Yeah.
wisdom of going there?
Yeah. Well, I'll say at the top here, when I first got sick, obviously I was a single parent, um, and I went looking for contemporary material from other single parents that were working through a terminal health diagnosis because I thought,
Mm,
well, I mean, there have got to be millions of us, right? I found nothing. I
mm,
found nothing. Now, maybe I didn't look hard enough, and one of your listeners might say, oh, she missed it. But I couldn't find anything. And I just thought, okay, well, I don't know if I'm the one to write it, but this needs to be a companion
Mm.
to, first of all parents and loved ones, but in particular, single parents, because I promise you, we hold um, the depth and the gravity of this a little differently.
Yeah.
We just work through different scenarios in our mind, and it is particularly terrible. Now, that said, I've also been surrounded by extraordinary miracles. And so while this is by far the hardest set of corners of the last room, I will say at the front end that it's also been some of the most stunning and kind of redemptive elements that I've learned about this sort of larger expanse of this larger story. That even if I leave my kids way too soon, they are going to be surrounded by um, great adults, great family. Again, their wonderful dad. And it's a terrible hand they've been dealt. There's no doubt. When I got sick, they were 16 and 14 at the time.
Mm.
Today, they're 21 and 19.
Mm.
So one of the things that I've learned that's been kind of transformative for me is working through this conversation with a 16 and 14-year-old is like totally different from a 19 and 21-year-old.
Mm.
So one of the things that I decided early on was I was never going to lie to my kids. I was always going to be very, very clear. But the way that I framed truth, and the book is organized through the virtues that Paul gives us from Philippians 4:8. And we may not have time for it, but he was a last room person, sort of the way I was.
Mm.
He'd written this letter to Philippi, a community that he adored, and he was in a Roman jail and probably knew his days were numbered.
Mm.
So he was sort of occupying this last room, sort of the way I was, and he gave this community in Philippi his very best heart. And one of the virtues that he gives in Philippians 4:8 is hold fast to whatever is true. And that's the first word that he uses in the list. As we know, Paul loves lists, and he starts with truth. So I thought, okay, this is a family that's gone through betrayal. We've suffered from the space of lies. We're not going to do that, but I can soften the edges of this that's appropriate for a 16 and 14-year-old. So I told them the reality of my diagnosis. They came to the hospital to see me, and at the time, I was literally at that point physically getting chemotherapy, and I said, but that liquid in that bag, it's called chemotherapy. And I said, some people call it poison. We're not going to call it poison. It's a miracle.
Mm.
For decades, chemists and others came to work every day and created something in that bag that is saving my life. And other moms were part of trials, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. She built the bridge for me to receive this drug that is going to work. And if it doesn't work, we're going to face that. But today we know it's going to work. And so that was true. But what I didn't do is to say, look, you guys, the odds of this are terrible. We have to face it. Now, look, on the one hand, you'd say, well, hold on a minute. They're going to Google everything about this. And I'm sure they did. But we sort of held fast to the reality, but with sort of what I call kind of like the dosing is very important in medicine, but it's also important in life.
Mm.
So I sort of dosed the truth in a way that was appropriate for their teenage years. Okay, today we talk about this really differently. 21 and 19, don't underestimate them. They are young adults, and they can hold some of the hardest
Mm.
elements.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm amazed. I'll tell you one little funny story. My health really took a hard turn a year ago. The kind of classic lines of chemo stopped working for me, and I had a tough scan. And I came home, and my son was at college at the time, so my daughter was home. And let's see, so she was 17 at the time. And I said, look, I want to tell you what's happened. It was a tough scan today. We've seen some growth in my lung. The medicines I've been taking don't seem to be working, but I want to tell you something that is extraordinary because I've been on the phone all afternoon. There is a new drug that is holding so much promise that they want me to start on this drug immediately, but I have to go to Arizona to get it because it's a special place and they realize that I'm a good fit for this. And I think like this is like some of the best news we've ever heard. I mean, this is incredible. So I'm kind of spinning my way through this. And my daughter looks at me and she goes, "You mean like you're going to do like a clinical trial?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to do a trial. Like that's what we're going to do." And she's like, "All right, that seems to make sense." She goes like, "Trials are really tricky though. Like there's no data, right?" I said,
Mm.
"Yeah,
You
that's
got a
true."
little budding scientist there.
And I thought, okay, the days of 14 are done. Like she can handle it. So you learn, parents, it's
Yeah.
so fun. You realize, oh, I had no idea. Like they got really smart overnight. So uh, it's different when you do this individually. There's no doubt. There's some great scenes in the book where some friends offer some kind of extraordinary moments of wanting to be walking alongside my kids, whether or not I'm here or not.
Yeah.
Um, I guess the last thing I would say is, yeah, just don't underestimate what happens as they age through this. They this summer experienced a lot of trauma.
Mm.
I was thinking the other day, let's see, between April and August, I experienced 4 ER visits, 4 ambulance rides,
Oh, geez.
some really hard physical moments, kind of the outer edges of pain. My daughter was there for 3 of them. And I hold that as a reality. No now 19-year-old should ever have to be in an ER overnight with their mom while she's just weeping with pain. That's terrible. And we've talked a lot about that. Um, I also know she is developing a deeper set of muscles to understand what it's like to be present to the terrible. And
Mm.
she's going to be able to provide a
Mm.
place of empathy and understanding
Mm.
in her 30s that others may not have. That is a hard price to pay, and I wouldn't
Mm.
wish it on anyone, but I am amazed at how my kids are even embracing the larger story that comes um, with hardship. There is quite a bit of Frederick Buechner's sort of wisdom sprinkled through the book, and in fact, the epigram in the beginning of the book, sort of the dedication frame, is a line of his that's often quoted, and he says this: "Here is the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid." And that, I think, sums up the human experience, but also certainly those of us who carry a faith tradition. Um, I think is one of the great summations of our lives, because we will all experience beautiful and terrible. We will have different, expressions of that throughout our lives. But the real command of that is to not be afraid, to embrace both. And that's been a through line of the last 5 years of my life. We try to find humor in this. There was a moment when I was in an ER, just it was so terrible. And I looked at my daughter. I said, "Someday we are going to laugh about this, right?" And she's like, "I don't know that we are. I just don't know that we are." And I said, "Give it a couple years. I think we're going to find it." And she's like, "I'm not ready right now." And I said, "All right, that's fair." But what I mean by that is she'll see beauty in those awful moments that were deeply terrible. And that is the human experience.
Yeah.
And parents who have to navigate this are in a very, very complicated space. I'm doing the best that I can, and I'm learning from a lot of others. But I'm glad you picked up on that, because this is a book that really doubles down on the sacredness of that calling to parent while you're broken. And that's been a lot of what the last 5 years have been about.
Well, thank you for sharing that gift with us. It is a picture of terrible beauty, and parenting, especially parenting adolescents, I think is full of all sorts of terrible beauties. And this is a really beautiful and brave guide that you've provided for us for how to navigate all of that. So thank you, Amy. I think listeners who are have been listening to this and will read your book are going to naturally want to think about you, envision you, and what your life is like now. I think many of them will want to pray for you. Help us know how to imagine your life right now in this moment,
Yeah.
and how to pray for you in this moment.
Well, you can keep track of how I'm doing. I have a Substack blog. It's
Okay.
called Postcards from the Mountain. So it's easy to find. I think it's the only one that's called that. I've got some people follow it. I always say, come for the cancer and stay for the other stuff, because I typically always have kind of a set of questions that I'm dealing with or some insights that I'm exploring. But if you want, like, no, I actually just want to know, like, how she's doing. I do keep that regularly updated. I will say with full confidence, I am here 5+ years because of the most generous prayers that I've received from people I've met, people I've never met. And one of the great joys of this book is that a whole new kind of chorus of companions have drawn closer to my story. So it's a huge thank you to advance to anyone who wants to keep me close to their heart or pray very specifically for the next, chapter that I'm facing. But the blog is probably the easiest way to kind of keep track of, what's what for where I'm at now.
Well, we'll make sure to put that in the show notes. And listeners, I really strongly encourage you to go ahead and get and read The Brave in Between, Notes from the Last Room by Amy Lowe. Amy, thank you so much for the gift of this book and the gift of this conversation.
Thanks, Curtis. This was such a treat. I really appreciate your questions.
All right, listeners, we will once again continue this journey that we know has a combination of this terrible beauty. And that's why we gather together to share about it and talk about it and make sense of it when we gather once again around the campfire.